We're glad to have you with us today for this discussion, this evening for us and this morning for you, and we hope we can have a fruitful interview with you. So, starting with our first question, um, so you had a long career as a U.S. diplomat across nearly 40 years in service. You have served as under a wide variety of presidents. You have served under Mr. Eisenhower, Mr. JFK, Mr. Ford, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, etc. Could you give us a brief on how the foreign policy of the United States changed across different presidents, not just restricted by party guidelines in terms of foreign policy, but the behavior of the president himself affecting the foreign policy of the country?
Yeah, that's a huge and important question, and I probably could take an hour to answer it in any detail, but let me give you one way of looking at the question you've asked me. And I'll take you back to 1945. At the end of World War II, the United States stood in a dominant position on the world stage. Of course, it was challenged in that by the erstwhile Soviet Union in terms of the control of Eastern Europe and an ideological challenge elsewhere. But the United States not only had military capability, it had a political set of arrangements, particularly with nations in Europe that had recently come out from under Nazi or fascist rule, and it had economic power. It had extraordinary economic strength relative to the rest of the world. And so it could lead the world not only by its single example, but by the shaping of core international institutions. And so in San Francisco, the United Nations was launched and its subordinate agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, to deal with the economic issues in the aftermath of World War II. All of these institutions were either launched by, led by, heavily influenced in their composition by the United States. And then, in terms of the recovery from World War II, whether it was in Japan, eventually, or in Europe, the United States took front seat in providing resources for European and global economic recovery. That put the United States in an absolutely commanding position. Perhaps at the time we didn't fully see how commanding, and the threat of then perceived Soviet military capability held our attention. But we were, in effect, the commanding global power. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that left the United States standing virtually with an unparalleled position on the world stage. But at any time in human history, as far as I'm concerned, any time in human history that one power grows in strength, grows in perception of ambition, other powers, other events, other coalitions, other forces will align to counterbalance that power. And so it was at the height of our power in 1989, we began to find ourselves challenged by rivalry, a rising China, eventually a recovering Russia in the great power sphere, but we found ourselves in a very different economic situation. Global economic power had been diffused, had been spread. So while the United States had a strong economy, it was by no means the giant. It had slipped in relative circumstances to other nations. We then compounded our problems in the 1990s by two major ill-advised wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which had two effects. The first effect was to take this marvelous instrument called the American military, which was perceived to have virtually infinite power, but by using that power was shown not to be able to accomplish objectives, and therefore gave rise to some pretty serious challenges. People like Al Qaeda, Daesh, all were able to defy American power and get away with it. Our military was proved to be not all powerful, but with feet of clay. Second, we had another negative effect after 1989 and our misadventures in the Middle East was to undercut our domestic support for a leadership position in foreign policy. Americans looked at the cost in blood and treasure. They had less confidence in Washington, the administration, several of them leadership in foreign affairs, and it set a stage for an American retreat, both our own sense of retreat and a sense of opposition from others. So today, phase 3. The United States finds itself among equals or among other powers. We no longer own the scales, but we do have the ability to put our finger on the scales to tip them in ways that are important to the United States or issues important to us. For example, the maintenance of peace and security. And so the adroit, skillful, nuanced use of policy, politics, diplomacy, intelligence, and leaving military in a recessed position is the way forward for the United States. Of course, that assumes on our part our ability to overcome our partisan differences and rebuild our economy, which I personally think is conceivable, but will not be easy. So we're at a very different place in the world today. And in a brief description, that's the way I see the evolution.
Right, sir. So moving on to the next question. You were heavily involved from a diplomatic standpoint as the senior deputy assistant secretary for African affairs from 1982 to 1986 in a very conflict-oriented environment. And this also coincided with the end of apartheid in South Africa. So what was your primary goal during this period? As in, what was the best possible outcome as the senior deputy assistant secretary?
Well, it's a very important question, and it flowed from a single event. The Southern Africa had sat on the sidelines of the Cold War. The South Africans were strong enough to dominate their region. The Portuguese were still strong enough to control Angola, Mozambique. The breakaway government in Salisbury was able to control Rhodesia, and the liberation movements, even backed rather weakly by the erstwhile Soviet Union, was unable to change that balance. In short, to summarize, Southern Africa stayed on the margins of the Cold War until the Portuguese Revolution took place. And when it did, the new military government in Portugal made a decision to get out of Africa, out of Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, out of Angola, and out of Mozambique. And as the Portuguese withdrew, East Timor separately, as the Portuguese withdrew, they withdrew and left behind pretty chaotic situations. In Mozambique, they left a single liberation movement, Frelimo. But in Angola, they left contestants. And so virtually immediately on the retreat of the Portuguese, a civil war broke out. And one of the contestants in that civil war, the MPLA, appealed to the Cubans, they to the Russians. And for the first time, the Cold War in any serious military manner arrived on Africa's shores. Well, the Americans were facing an election in 1976, and to see, after Afghanistan and all the problems that we'd faced, to see Southern Africa suddenly become a Cold War battle zone could not leave the United States indifferent. And that is when President Ford instructed Secretary Kissinger to roll up his sleeves. I was part of Kissinger's team and become involved. The involvement was to try to contain Soviet power in Southern Africa, to contain the Cuban military intervention, and to create, and to do this, to do it politically, not to do it militarily, do it politically, to create a different set of circumstances so that Africa was not aligned with the liberation of Southern Africa, but for aligned in trying to produce a stable outcome. So American diplomacy sought at that point to address the intrusion and to do so to create independence in Zimbabwe and in Namibia, and do that with the agreement of the South Africans, so that the nations outside of South Africa would emerge on their own. Africa's desire for full liberation would take a big step forward, and the Soviets and Cubans would not find fertile ground. That was the objective of the Kissinger policy. And it took a variety of forms I could go into in much greater detail. I won't, but that was the core objective, to blunt Soviet/Cuban intervention by creating circumstances not threatening to South Africa, but would transfer majority rule in Rhodesia to make it into Zimbabwe and to bring about the independence of Namibia, which South Africa only had a tenuous claim to. So that was the purpose of the diplomacy. The administration changed in Washington. Carter came, and he added a key new feature, and that was we had to align ourselves as Americans to try to bring an end, to use American power to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. And so in addition to the liberation of the territories, Zimbabwe, Namibia, we added the issue of apartheid. That, in the subsequent Reagan administration, was refined in a policy that came to be work still for the independence and stability of the region, but to give South Africa cause to back away from apartheid. All eventually worked out, though it was highly contested at every inch of the way, including domestically. But those were our objectives over the period that you mentioned.
Right, sir. So shifting a bit from the Africa to Middle East, on January 31st, 2011, you were sent to Egypt by then President Barack Obama to negotiate a resolution for the popular protests against the regime, and that had swept the country. Your vast experience in the region, as well as the relation you had with the Egyptian government, all the way to the top, was one of the contributing factors towards you being picked to be sent to Egypt out of retirement. Could you walk us through a bit briefly about what happened once you reached Egypt, and what happened after your iconic speech at the security conference in Egypt?
Fine, happy to do that. But let me just reset the stage slightly so that it brings it into the focus that I had as I was asked to undertake a mission to Egypt and attempted to carry it out. The purpose of my mission at the time was not to try to preserve the Mubarak regime or even create some compromise between the Mubarak regime and the protesters on the streets in Tahrir Square, but rather to encourage the regime to adopt the policies needed to bring about a transition away from the Mubarak regime to a stable future, hopefully a democratic one for Egypt, to put its weight behind a transition on the road to democracy. That was the purpose. And to encourage the government, President Mubarak at the time, not to use force, not to allow, not to deploy the military against the protesters, not only in Cairo, but in a number of other key cities around Egypt in the canal, Alexandria on the north coast. So the objective was not to preserve the regime, but to organize a transition away from that regime to a stable future. The Mubarak, my discussions with President Mubarak took place with those as my instructions, and he made it clear to me that he did not intend to hang on to power. He was going to change his government in the short term. He undertook not to, pledged not to use force, and he made it clear that he would try to preserve Egypt's stability. He had particular eye on the threat of the rise of Islamic radicals in the form of the Muslim Brothers. The problem was that the protests were already well advanced. And there were also those inside Egypt who had made their minds up. They wanted to replace Mubarak and assure a continuity. And so a dual tension. On the surface, it looked like the game was with the protesters, but behind that game were also many in the military who wanted to preserve their stake, but all were aimed at one thing, getting Mubarak out. And they succeeded. And then followed a period of tension, confusion, and uncertainty, in which a brief spell with Muslim Brothers in political control and the military in security control until 2013, when the military capitalized on public sentiment and moved against the Muslim Brother government, incarcerated much of its leadership, and under Field Marshal Sisi, now President Sisi, took complete control of Egypt, which is where it remains today. That's the event. The United States, as I say, had a different objective. We wanted to see an orderly transition on the road to democracy. We underestimated the passion on the streets, and that our ability to influence in a decisive manner events in Egypt was limited. It was also not possible for us to control the ambitions of the military. And so we end up where we are today, almost the worst of several worlds. We end up not having achieved our objective of an orderly transition to democracy, and at the same time finding ourselves blamed by many in Egypt for having brought the Muslim Brothers to the fore. I look back on this period with one major conclusion, and that is the right policy for the United States was to do what we aim to do, help a transition on the road to democracy. And even if we didn't succeed, that was the right policy for the United States. It put us in a good light, not to call for the downfall of Mubarak, which ill-advisedly the Obama administration turned quickly to, but to be the progenitors of a stable democratic transition. I think we would have been seen throughout the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East as friends of order, not progenitors, not provokers of chaos. So I regret the way our policies played out when we then tried to protect democracy, and that meant leaving the Muslim Brothers. We went into a period of considerable hostility from much of Egypt without having any control over the eventual military takeover.
Right, sir. So, shifting to a more recent issue that happened at our very border with China. I'm sure you're aware with the escalations that have been happening with the Chinese government at the border of a northeast region of a country. I just wanted to get your take on why do you think the Chinese government has started acting so aggressively at a point where the entire international community is supposedly trying to blame them or is blaming them for allegedly delaying the response to COVID crisis? Do you think this is a move to use nationalism as an instrument to safeguard their citizens' trust in the government, or is this just a strategic move which has been planned for a long time? I want to get a diplomat's take on what's happening at the border right now.
Well, we're looking at two different issues: Chinese policy, Chinese strategy, and on the other hand, the situation in the border. They're two linked but separate questions. Let me address the first, as I believe it's the more important and it pertains to your question. As I look at China, China has been determined to correct the course of history in which China was humiliated as a nation, disadvantaged, disobliged, and victimized. And that victimization and chaos led to the Chinese Communist Party winning in the Civil War, taking over the country, whether its policies were always ones that you and I would agree with is a different matter, but where they aligned themselves was on reconstructing China's place in Asia and in the world, building Chinese power, asserting China's definition of Chinese national interests. That is laid at the heart of the mission of the Chinese Communist Party, and it is one of the reasons that the communist regime, in addition to its remarkable economic success, has maintained a degree of popular support for its actions. The question was how harsh, how much foot on the pedal the Chinese would apply as they came through into the 1990s, the early part of this century. The strategy they had pursued was to keep China's profile low, to build its strength at home before it asserted its footprint on the global stage or the regional stage. But with 2007, 2008, and the weakening perception of the United States, its political and economic power, Xi Jinping, now in charge, having taken full control of his own party, began to design a more aggressive Chinese posture. So where we see China today is a long-term strategy with a short-term boost to it. And here is where we stand as China looks at the world at large. It looks at it with many dimensions. It looks at it in an economic dimension to open trade routes and economic ties all the way to Europe, one belt, one road, to guarantee Chinese influence and Chinese markets for the time still to come and the continued progress of the Chinese economy. It looks at its neighborhood in reasserting Chinese rights to what China believes are its historic borders, which China has regarded as having been snatched from it at various moments in China's history. And third, to reestablish Chinese influence in the region where other nations understand, accept China's image, accept Chinese interests in defining their national interests, and in effect, it's a hierarchical system with China at the center. Now, in the latter two regards, first, with regard to territory, and second, to regard to its political position, China wants to be very clear. It has boundaries and it intends to carry them out. So whether you're looking at the Senkaku Islands off of Japan, or you're looking at the traditional assertion of Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, or you're looking at the South China Sea. You've seen Chinese moves to assert China's position in each of those regards. When you come to your border areas with China, which are contested, were never resolved, or a cause of conflict in the past, China is highly sensitive to appearing to be wrong-footed. If they see you advancing, they will not retreat, they will push back. Whichever narrative you look at, China is going to insist on being taken seriously. So that leaves India with a real challenge. Your northern frontiers are not established international borders. China is asserting claims to areas that Indian forces occupy. India asserts claims to territory China occupies. And so the situation is there to be dealt with and to be managed. Can it be managed politically? I really believe it can only be managed if India increases its strength domestically and militarily on the one hand, and increases its political leverage by strengthening its ties to other nations in Asia, Australia, the Southeast Asians, the Japanese, and strengthening its ties to Washington to counterbalance Chinese political pressure by producing counter pressure. China does not want a war with India, and I am certain India doesn't want a war with China. So the question is how to manage competition, and that's the task before Indian statesmen today.
What, according to you, is the geopolitical implications of involving India in the Security Council as a regular rotation? You spoke about the importance of the UN in 1945 when you answered our first question. Taking that into context and the entire geopolitical discussion we had with China, what aid does the effect of India's enrollment have on that issue? And in an overall sense, how important is this enrollment in geopolitics for India?
Well, let me try two answers to your very good question. First answer is the question of the Security Council. Throughout my experience and lifetime with India, I have found Indian statesmen of whatever party fixated on the need of the world and for India to recognize that India's power and attributes as an ancient civilization and a modern economic and military power be recognized, and that India be given a place at the Security Council table as a right virtually. The problem with that ambition, which has dominated my experience with India, is not the analysis. The analysis is absolutely correct. India deserves a seat at this global high table. The problem is the rules are complex and are structured in a manner that virtually make it impossible for India to enter the Security Council. Now, the United States would favor India being on the Security Council, but the United States does not control the Security Council. Any nation joining the Security Council must be, particularly as a permanent member, and particularly as a permanent member with veto rights, has got to be agreed to by all parties. And as matters now stand, China simply is going to block Indian entry. And there's nothing you can do about that, nor we can do about it. So the question is then to maintain the ambition, perfectly reasonable, but to exercise the responsibilities and rights of Indian foreign policy and interests of India in alternative measures. And I argue that you don't need to be a member of the Security Council to have an important foreign policy that defends your national security interests and promotes your national prosperity. India has proved it can be a terrific member of the international community through your many interventions as peacekeeping nation under UN flags. You're clearly a good UN member. That's not at issue. At the same time, India's ability to create alliances, to build ties to Japan, to the United States, for example, in the China case, doesn't lie in the Security Council. It lies in the skill of New Delhi's diplomacy and in the vision of India's leaders. India's ability to have a global footprint, to have impact in Africa, in the Middle East, doesn't depend on its place in Turtle Bay. It depends on the vigor and vision of Indian statesmanship. So my argument with my Indian friends is keep alive. You're right. You have a right to the Security Council, but focus instead on the accrual, the gathering of Indian national power and the assertion of Indian interests through statecraft, building alliances that maintain balance and, of course, maintain peace and prosperity in your region and in the global commons, and address the cruel and crushing and important issues that we all face, major issues that have nothing to do with the Security Council, like climate change or refugee movements or pandemics. These are questions that have to be addressed by sovereign governments acting wisely.
Right, sir. Glad that you brought up this important aspect of using diplomacy and statesmanship to solve issues and not just relying on the UN Security Council. But since we're short of time, I'm just going to rephrase it into a smaller question so we can have a smaller answer. In conclusion, so we're a student editorial and our readers are university students. So seeing as that many students would probably want to aspire towards having a career in diplomacy and becoming the leaders of tomorrow, what would, in short, your recommendations or guidance be to them to take this career up?
Well, first of all, I can very simply state, pursue your ambition, make your dream a reality, and aim to be part of India's place in the world. Whether you do it as an Indian diplomat, on the political stage, or in many of the supporting ways, Indian business, for example, can all contribute to the strengthening of India and her global footprint. No question, but keep that as a core ambition. Second, it is really important to set out strategy. And strategy is a course of action, and your great philosopher Kautila would teach this to you in 5 minutes, that strategy is based on an assessment of where you want to get to, and it means you measure your path there by the resources you have and the public and political backing you have at home to arrive at that destination. And then you come up with policies, and you can exercise those policies with national instruments, diplomacy, hopefully not holding in recess military options. So keep strategy at the center of your mind at every stage in whatever undertaking. Where do I want to get to? What are the means I have at my disposal? And how do I deploy those means? Is the best guidance I can share based on my career of 40 years in American diplomacy. And unfortunately, I can't tell you we've always followed those rules.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for being here with us. It was an amazing time conversing with you on diplomacy and foreign policy. We really inspired